全てを捨てて戦う男デビルはローは超音波デビルイヤーは地獄耳デビルウィングは空を飛びデビルビーは熱望
If Osamu Tezuka and his pantheon of works were the father and foundation of manga, then Go Nagai would be the cool uncle that taught you stuff your parents shouldn't tell you, like skipping school or having a drink. Or, in the case of Go Nagai specifically, teaching anime about sex, drugs, and violence, and cool robots, and not those political, methodical kind either. I'll argue that Go Nagai is the progenitor of several of the larger manga and anime genres that we know today. Like the general concept of being very hot-blooded, super robots, magical girls, and one of my favorites, the hyper-violent and hyper-sexual series that we will talk about a lot more today because the subject of today is Devilman. And Devilman is one of those works that is very influential on anime and manga as a whole. Go Nagai's works tend to have a certain air of masculinity to them, and not just in the normal hot-blooded man way, but his heroes aren't just necessarily muscular and angry buff dudes, but they're angry and very violent buff dudes, that most shonen now has sort of cleaned up in some respects, in regards to replacing the sheer anger with various levels of purity and nobility to them. But Go Nagai's heroes don't do that. They're all about blood, sweat, sinew, and sex, I guess. They really dig into that primal id that makes people into animals. And Devilman does dive into this a lot, and that actually is one of the central elements to the series. Even if you're not necessarily familiar with Devilman, and you were not one of the people that checked out the Masaki Yuasa reboot Devilman Crybaby, you almost no doubt seen at least some of its influence on the broader anime and manga circle as a whole, with works that take a lot of notes from Devilman, like Fist of the North Star, Berserk, and the general flavor of Gainax's heroes, I meant to list some, but really it's so influential that it's all of them except for Luluko and Eiko. Violence in Go Nagai works aren't generally characterized as modern shonen series do, where they have a certain air of nobility to them, and combat plays out almost like a video game, where you can almost feel the HP bars going down, but always have a certain tangibility of being straight up violent. These characters aren't necessarily motivated by a want to fight, but primarily by having a certain amount of reptile brain, sweat, and bloodlust. The winner isn't normally determined by the culmination of friends both won and lost along the way, along with any additional lessons, but by who can show the most amount of grit. There's no amount of, it would be cool to fight again as we are serialized shonen characters and it would be a shame to kill one of us off, but more as when the fight is over, one of these two people will just be a bloody mess on the ground. This shows through in his artwork as well, where I say it has a certain Genndy Tartakovsky-esque attitude to it, specifically with Samurai Jack or early Powerpuff Girl line work, where it always looks a little bit wonky and maybe a tiny bit unpolished, but it goes to serve a very specific purpose in that every line and every panel goes into conveying a specific emotion and not in the service of necessarily having a cohesive drawing as a whole. And for the work of Go Nagai, the primary emotion that is trying to be expressed by these drawings at any given time is almost always anger. While I could talk about the infinite number of spin-offs that Devilman has, or the almost inignorable interpretation of Devilman Crybaby, I feel like it would be a better idea to condense the focus of this particular video onto the original Devilman. Even if we do live in a post-Crybaby world, and Crybaby's influence on anime in general, let alone the Devilman property, is almost inignorable. So that may be something that we touch down on some other time. But for the time being, just know that Devilman Crybaby, while looking radically different from the original manga, mostly tells the same story. And interestingly enough, the anime Devilman that would have came out at roughly the same time is an entirely different animal altogether that hardly contains any of the stuff that I said Go Nagai's works normally have, as the two of them were basically made in tandem. They are interesting in terms of how radically different they are. In fact, the only two things they have in common are some of the main characters, and that is basically it. Even the basic premise is entirely different. Where the Devilman manga is primarily a drama, I suppose, a hyper-violent, almost theater play-like work that even takes about as long to read as a theater play would take to watch, the Devilman anime, on the other hand, almost feels like a tokusatsu-like work that has about 52 episodes and changed Devilman from a Krampus-style looking demon to a proper tokusatsu-style hero. But the production of the Devilman anime is a story that is very interesting that we'll leave for another day. For the time being, let's actually dig into the actual content itself, the Devilman manga. Devilman is the story of Akira Fudo, who is a very kind-hearted, milquetoast meek individual. He has a girlfriend named Miki Makimura, which is a fun name to say 3 times fast. As the two are going home from school one day, they are harassed by a group of bullies. Akira, being a especially soft-hearted and perhaps even a little weak-willed person, opts to walk away when really he should fight them. Then Akira's friend Ryo shows up and breaks out a shotgun, telling the bullies to beat it, basically. Ryo drags Akira away and gets him involved in a plot to somehow stop demons from taking over the earth, which is a lot for Akira to take in, but this is helped by them being chased down by one of the demons. And the situation seems to be that demons were once long ago frozen in ice. And Ryo's father ended up discovering this conspiracy, but would one day go mad and end up killing himself. Ryo figures that the only way to stop this incoming apocalypse is to recruit his good friend Akira, because Akira is a very kind-hearted person, so much so that in theory he should be able to have a demon possess him, but have Akira's heart be just pure enough and strong enough to resist the demonic infiltration. So in theory, Akira should be able to take this demon's body and have that part of the process happen while not having his self or general pure spirit corrupted. The plan on doing this is actually somewhat telling on perhaps Go Nagai's feelings on drugs and alcohol. Ryo sets up a drug-fueled orgy, and this is because the best way to have demons show up is quote-unquote to have them possess people that in some ways have lost their humanity. They're not thinking like a human, but like an animal. That makes people far, far more susceptible to being possessed. And I guess in this context, the idea of someone just being ready to have sex and just being super drunk and just ready to party in some ways clouds their judgment. And I guess they're trying to get at, in many ways, the ability to have that type of rational, sober idea is what makes you human. And I suppose one could also interpret the demons as the purest versions of human desires, but without the human mind to step in and say no. Or just being a walking id without an ego or superego to keep it in check. And I suppose that serves the reason as this would be at a time where Freudian psychology was taken a little bit more seriously and didn't just exclusively serve to be an aesthetic choice. But anyway, the ritual does end up working. The demons do show up, and they either manifest themselves by possessing people or just devouring everyone they can, with the lone exception of Akira, where Ryo's plan of having him be partially possessed by a demon but having the will to fight them off, but retaining that demonic body, effectively worked, turning Akira into the eponymous Devilman, where he then begins to ruthlessly slaughter all of the demons at the party, leaving him and Ryo as the only survivors. You would think if Akira was such a pure-hearted, noble individual, he would see that Ryo may be up to no good. I mean, sure, he did have Devilman be a thing because he wanted to save humanity, or at least to Akira's understanding, but it does seem dubious to schedule this mass sacrifice and not really ask too many questions. I've always found it interesting that in other adaptations of Devilman, even Devilman Crybaby, Akira seems to not have that much objection to Ryo basically orchestrating this mass human sacrifice. I'm not sure if this is some type of commentary on that old quote, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing," but I guess this could be the application of that in regards to someone saying that they're doing something for the greater good, because ultimately Devilman does have the ability to save the world, and humanity has very few resources for fighting off demons. And I guess from a numbers sense, that does more or less make sense, but on the other hand, it just feels very odd that Akira would have nothing to say. Akira is a very weak and milquetoast person, so it does make sense that he wouldn't really be socially cognizant enough to challenge Ryo on this type of thing, but it does seem equally odd that Akira never has any moment of personal hesitation or some type of Rick and Morty style, gee, I don't know about this one, Rick, but it just never really comes up. Anyway, the next day we see that Akira has gone through some changes that are coded as puberty. He still has the same heart as before, still fundamentally the same very sweet person with a righteous spirit. Except, of course, that time Ryo just started opening fire on people and orchestrating a mass sacrifice. But outside of that, Akira is basically the same person. Except for now, he has fused with the demon Amon. Amon is another character that is very important to Devilman lore, that is mostly explained in supplementary material, but for the time being, know that fusing with the demon Amon has given Akira, for lack of better words, peak puberty culture, if you will. He doesn't care now. He has cool things like pubic hair, I guess, no more crying stuff, unless of course it's manly tears. Mickey is also very down for this idea, being very into Akira, now being a more alpha Chad who's more interested in standing up for himself, or, because it's a Go Nagai work, actually having sex. From here, Devilman more or less plays out as a Monster of the Week story, where Akira and his friends are doing their thing, and usually a demon or something will attack one of his friends or family or a random bystander. Akira then transforms into the Devilman and rips them to shreds in wonderful, bloody, gory style. Or at least bloody and gory relative to the early 70s, as that particular flavor of ultraviolence wouldn't quite be mastered until a decade later. Among these weekly fiends are Amon's ex-lover, Siren, who is pretty upset about this whole Amon's passion and fury and power being given to just a normal human brain. Akira understands that he has Amon's body, and with that he's inherited at least some of Amon's spirit, and at the very least his demon warrior pride with his bloodlust. Siren just thinks that at best this is nonsense, and at worst it's outright offensive, if not bordering on appropriation. But we'll talk more about Siren and the other demons that Akira fights along the way some other time. At about this point in the story, if you're reading along at home with your classic Devilman collection, you'll notice that Akira and Ryo just kind of go back in time and begin fighting demons in the past and end up causing several historical events to happen, like Hitler's other backstory, the goddess Nike dropping off guns in Roman times, and you may be thinking, this seems a little out of character for Devilman, and that's because it's not quite Devilman. It is Shin Devilman, that is a spin-off that takes place during the events of Devilman and is weird and out of place. To my understanding, it's kind of common for the mediocre Shin Devilman spinoff to be slid before the third act of classic Devilman. This one is pretty light on content, and we'll come back to that some other day if we ever talk about Devilman supplementary material. But for the time being, just know it happened, and actually isn't super relevant, and if anything, it's just sort of distracting. But if you are interested in how strange it is and how certain parts of Go Nagai works may not age as well as they could have, just know that they try to give Hitler a sympathetic backstory that involves demons. So after several fun adventures, and also Shin Devilman, I guess, including one adventure where Akira has to punch a kid's face off, it's becoming clear that the demonic threat is becoming more and more menacing. And it's not always a demon who's just offended by Akira existing and trying to lure him into a fight. This leads to one of my favorite chapters, that may be also one of the more thoughtful ones, and another entry in my favorite horror subgenre, children getting hurt. One where a child runs away from home from his abusive mother, and his father comes home late, and can't really be bothered hearing all of this domestic abuse, and his mom just denies it. The child finds a friend to confide all this information into. So they go to his house to play, but the child mom shows up, and she's secretly really mad, even though she's not showing it. So the child's friend decides to try to defend him, but knowing that this is only going to make this domestic abuse situation worse, he just says, "Oh, I just fabricated all that. I just made it up. Just ignore it." And what happens next is what happens next, where it turns out they were demons all along, and they just eat the child. Maybe this is some type of commentary on how sometimes Japanese domestic issues can just go basically unanswered. But I'm not really a sociologist, or at the very least not a sociologist that has a huge background in Japanese politics, but it does serve to reason that this could be some type of commentary on a past culture that does not have a lot of the social tools that we have now, or a dynamic understanding of family that we also do now as well, where that type of domestic punishment can be entirely overlooked and ignored because a your word against mine in that type of situation never really goes well for the child. And this is mostly because children simply don't have the tools necessary to express the abuse that they are going through. So Akira turns to the camera at this point and basically plays with the comic book format in ways that we generally don't see much in modern manga today, and announces that we are now at the third act and the story is going to get significantly more serious and carry a more overtly environmental message. So, where the demons were before just attacking random people, or just Devilman being not a character that they like very much, they begin trying to fuse with people just out in the open. And people that are otherwise under the influence would be relatively easy to fuse with, now they're just fusing with random people, which doesn't work. As per Devilman rules, if a human is not primed to be fused with, but they try to fuse with them anyway, they'll die. But if they're just not a strong enough person, then the human will also die as well. The demons start doing this en masse in public to sow widespread panic among humans. They try things like taking over schools. That's actually one of the better arcs in the series that I'll come back to when we talk about characters, and talking about how soon the great Lord Zenon is going to disembowel Akira and rip out his teeth and all sorts of stuff. So the demon taxes are starting to get way more brutal and widespread and dangerous. And on top of that, the random demon fusions are successful, so there are just people out there who are simply now demons. Some of them have even infiltrated the military, which, when you think about it, that is probably something that is born of this work being made in the Cold War. And also happens to be something that happens in Shin Megami Tensei, which, again, takes a lot of influence from Devilman. The demons even get around to blowing up Russia. It's worth noting that this work would have came out at the very height of the Cold War. At this time, it's becoming more apparent that Ryo just wants Akira to give up on humanity, because while demons are also being awful, humans are also not being as great too. And frankly, the demon invasion is just not something Akira is entirely up to handling on his own. And again, that whole demon fusion thing in the middle of day is causing mad spread panic. Primarily because a failed demon fusion just makes for a Cronenbergian mess and then a dead body. Mondays, am I right? Akira understands that this is just getting out of hand. He can only handle so much as one person, even if the demon Amon did grant him might that's above the average demon. So he has a pretty clever and actually kind of humble idea. This whole time we've been making a big deal about how pure and good-willed and strong-hearted Akira is, but the fact of the matter is, he is a person that's able to make mistakes. He's a perfectly fallible person who's doing his best, and it stands to reason that there are plenty of other people that probably have been attacked by a demon, and probably were just as good as people as Akira. Maybe not a huge number, but it has to be a few. There has to be several devil men out there in the world right now, and Akira should really link up with them to make something work, because he can't do this alone, but he probably could do it with a lot of people giving him a hand, and there's no doubt that if you're someone who's been fused with a demon, but retain your human mind, that you may be more sympathetic to Akira's cause to saving humanity. So it's revealed that Ryo, who's obviously evil, turned out to be evil. While he did attempt to protect Akira from the demon invasion by just telling him to give up and just go hide somewhere, as turns out, Ryo is evil. Yeah, I know, hard to believe the guy that would orchestrate a mass human sacrifice may not be entirely on the up and up. So it seems that Ryo was actually not even trying to defend Akira when he said to go hide. This was a subconscious tendency. As it turns out, Ryo's true identity is the demon chief Satan, who works with the demon lord Zenon. Satan would erase his own mind and plant himself with subliminal messages, so he would be raised as a normal human, but have a whole bunch of biases that would point him towards the path of evil, and eventually reveal himself to be the one and only Satan. His memories were restored by Psycho Jenny, who's another Devilman staple like Zenon and Siren that end up being important to the larger Devilman context and lore as a whole, but in its initial appearance, she's just a minor villain. Okay, so it wouldn't be Manga Dungeon if we didn't get at least a little bit political, besides a whole Cold War thing. But Ryo's pretty gay. Satan's plans end up being somewhat sabotaged by his human persona Ryo, that in many ways can be somewhat similar to the nature of Kaworu from Evangelion, and that the game plan was to just come down and get this over with, but over the course of the series, the fact that Kaworu, or more specifically in this case, Ryo, is just kind of gay and does fall for our main character, that really does throw some wrenches into the plan. But whereas Kaworu would be unambiguously one of Shinji's best friends, Ryo still retains that antagonistic relationship with Akira, but it just manifests itself differently, in that the plan was to kill Akira at some point, but instead Ryo, just being in love with Akira, just encourages him to go into hiding instead, which does effectively have the same result of that still demon world conquest, but also getting to spare Akira. Anyway, back onto the plot. While the demons are invaded, society has basically fallen apart, basically overnight. If it feels like I'm rushing to the end here, xenophobia and witch hunts and specialized demon weapons, and as well as cruel experimentation on the Devilmen, have just become common and disgusting. It's almost like humans are the real demons here. Akira is just totally sickened by everything he's seen here, from concentration camps to shock troopers being back in vogue, and if you really want to stretch the logic, the events of Shin Devilman that shows that humanity is just as capable of being bad as demons are. So Akira almost decides that humanity isn't really something worth fighting for after all, or at least for the most part. And let's not forget that whole Russia is just gone thing. But hey, something worth noting is that Miki, it's also worth fighting for. She's a wonderful person that did a lot of stuff and also has been killed by humanity. Scratch that, never mind. But for what it's worth, Miki Makimura actually goes out in a very interesting way. At this point in time in the 70s, you would expect that Miki Makimura would have just been shoved into a refrigerator, as you normally do with women psychic characters that get killed off to assist in the hero's journey. But Miki Makimura actually dies in a pretty interesting way and basically on her own terms, going down like a champ. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Akira says, you know what? Fuck this. It's revenge time. This is now a revenge battle. Humans are mostly killing each other out of fear anyway. There are probably some people that are still okay, but this is really more about getting back at Satan. So off-screen, about 20 years have passed. Akira has gathered an army of Devilmen to fight Satan once and for all. And they do. And the thing that ultimately may make Devilman much different from the way most anime things work out is that Akira is actually defeated by Satan. He is bisected, and it turns out that Satan reveals to Akira that he used to work with God. God created demons unintentionally and tasked Satan to eradicate them. However, Satan thought this was stupid because all life is worth living and they had a right to exist. And then he convinced the demons to freeze themselves in ice to conserve their strength for the day where they can once again rise from the ice, reclaim the earth, and challenge God to take it over. However, it looks like in the meanwhile, humans have kind of taken over the earth, and it would be a lot easier to just wipe those guys all out first. But after fighting Akira, Satan realizes that maybe Akira had a point. Wiping out all of humanity wouldn't make him any better than God, and him wiping out all of the demons. However, it's too late because Satan has already killed Akira, and the ultimate irony of his actions was that Ryo did all of this work to turn Akira into the Devilman, not to save humanity, but to specifically ensure that Akira would survive the incoming apocalypse because he loved Akira so much, thus ending the original Devilman, with Satan lying next to Akira's bisected corpse, just as God's angels descend down to cleanse the earth and start life anew, concluding the original Devilman. Now, as turns out, in a very influential on anime as a whole way, according to the extended lore, this kind of thing happens in a cycle that just sort of happens, and you can see this reinterpreted in things like Evangelion's Third Impact, or the eras of fire and darkness that are inherent to Dark Souls lore. However, this particular flavor of cycling doesn't just begin and end with Devilman, but just goes back thousands of years to countless mythologies, especially Eastern mythologies, where the world does occasionally end and begin again as new. And because of the modern way that we consume and understand storytelling, generally speaking, even if we have the understanding that things will restart, functionally speaking, this is the end of the story. Okay, so now it's time to talk about the characters. So Akira is a character that needs no introductions, and that's because I introduced him earlier. He is a soft-spoken, shy person, a strong contrast to his romantic interest, Miki Makimura. He has strong moral conventions, and not in the pure religious way, but in a more strong sense of right and wrong and strong character way. Unlike most shonen protagonists, Akira isn't someone who has much physical conviction. He does have the backbone to stand up to villains and say fight the power in the face of impossible odds, but he's not particularly motivated by friendship either. When the bullies start picking on him and his friend, he is fairly content to turn tail and run. In many ways, he is the modern man in some sense, or at least in terms of a patriarchal society, in that Akira is a character that doesn't really have a war to fight or any particular reason to aspire for any heroics or anything of that nature. This is the part where I should probably specify once again that I am not a Japanese sociologist, but just trying to read what I think the subtext is supposed to be here. And if I interpret that totally wrong, hey, leave a comment. I am not against being wrong or being corrected about this kind of thing. Akira isn't perfect, but he's certainly doing his best. And the place that he falters the most is with societal pressures. Both the societal pressure to remain weak in the face of being bullied, and to say nothing when Ryo is setting up, well, a mass human sacrifice. I stay on this a lot because it does seem very interesting that I guess one could argue that maybe Akira is just as bad as Ryo. He did let these things happen, but as a fundamental 8-brain test of character, a demon does try to take Akira over, and he does have the moral strength of character to fight them off. So I suppose on some level he has to be at least cognizant enough to remain a good person, even if he is just being a bystander, which after becoming Devilman he'd no longer do. So the narrative does have a certain disdain from people just standing there and not really doing anything, and I suppose becoming the Devilman is never seen as a bad or especially monstrous thing. I mean, it does at a certain point in the series, but as far as what the narrative is telling us about Akira, that never seems to be the case. And Akira's good nature could also just be interpreted as straight up naivete, mostly in regards to the fact that it took so long for him to understand that Ryo is not a good person. Now, in modern 2020 times, we do understand that drugs are fine, and smoking and drinking are basically fine. But, as far as it's coded in the narrative, these two are things that are not seen as fine, and Ryo does them both. In fact, the narrative seems to specifically show you that Ryo loves him some drugs, specifically because he's a bad guy. And I suppose Akira just kind of goes with it because Ryo retains some amount of plausible deniability. And I guess that is interesting that we do once again see counting people that are obvious villains as maybe not so much so, because they still retain a certain amount of plausible deniability. Like Ryo opens fire on people, but come on, they were trying to attack Akira, or Ryo orchestrates a Black Sabbath that would ultimately result in a mass human sacrifice, but ultimately it was for the sake of humanity. So who's to say if Ryo's really evil? While anyone with a pair of eyes and good senses could probably tell that Ryo is immediately someone who isn't trustworthy. And wouldn't you know, he's the one that ushers in the apocalypse. I also like to interpret the narrative of Akira just sort of standing there as these things happen as code for the idea that when people don't stand up for what they believe in or have the conviction to actually challenge things that just seem bad or just goes against their beliefs, this person who would sit there is incomplete. And for Akira, becoming the Devilman is what makes him complete. It makes him a plain as day metaphor for puberty and the idea that one does not truly become an adult until, on paper, they begin enjoying sex and violence. And in terms of the narrative framing, in terms of someone that can't just stand up for what they think. Because Akira letting these atrocities Ryo does happen, that's child things. That's letting someone else take the narrative from you. But Akira as the Devilman going out and saying, no more of this, I'm kicking your ass, that's what a real adult and a real hero does. And more importantly, that's what a real completed human being does. It's also notable that in a lot of other adaptations of Devilman, Akira is raised up as a Christian. And this is very interesting because Japan is not a country with a whole lot of Christians, so they do have an interesting outsider perspective. And I think this may be an interesting move to, in some interpretations, make Akira a Christian, because generally speaking, and I don't mean to throw my religious friends into the bus here, in the face of adversity, generally speaking, regardless of what we see from extremists on TV, the doctrine says to chill out. And the idea of just chilling out in the face of adversity, or at least in terms of how Devilman presents it, is not a great idea. And it's probably no accident that Satan looks far more angelic than he normally would be in fictional media. And he is the main one saying Akira should chill out instead of doing things. So, take that as you will. Again, not trying to throw my religious friends into the bus, it just seemed like an interesting observation. But I guess in a story where the good guy is literally called Devilman, it would make sense if the narrative would rub Christians in a not great way. Anyway, Akira as the Devilman is more in line with the stand your grounds belief, blood, sweat, and tears that other shonen protagonists would have, but in his case, a little bit more of a brutal way. Devilman still does retain that moral light that tells him what's right and wrong, but also finds himself not having the same social hangups that Akira would. Instead of having compromises, he goes for it. He's not playing will he won't he with Mickey, he's just going for it. And when it comes to fighting demons and fighting bad humans alike, he's not very interested in playing these sort of plausible deniability games and just ripping you a new one if he sees fit. While initially he is a little bit slow to apply this to human villainy, as the story goes on, this is greatly contested. Much of Akira's journey as the Devilman feels very much like a werewolf or Jekyll and Hyde story, where in some ways Akira is afraid of his own primal nature in a constant battle with himself to keep his newfound love of sex and violence in check, especially when the two happen to have overlap. Most of the sexual parts in Devilman are generally focused on in other adaptations, but it is here a little bit too. Mostly in regards of Akira trying his best not to be overwhelmed by Mickey. Specifically trying to quell the urge to eat or have sex with her, or at least have sex consensually, which if you have seen Beastars is something that is not just a subtext, but the actual text there as well. Which is probably a good time to talk about Siren. Siren represents a turning point for Akira. Before, most demons were just idiots that were just there to get their entrails scattered. But Siren is one of the few demons that knew the demon Amon before fusing with Akira, and also one of the few demons that bested Akira in battle. When Akira had realized that he had lost, he asked her for a quick death, but Siren doesn't acknowledge Akira's demon pride or heritage as Amon, and just sees it as a perversion of the demonic spirit, and is content to let him suffer and be dragged off to be vanquished by Lord Zenon. Akira is silently defeated by Siren and Game, another demon that she fuses with, and interestingly, Game would fuse himself with her more out of love, which is interesting because demons, in theory, don't really do love very well. But Siren just isn't able to finish off the job. She does soundly... Again, while she does soundly defeat Akira, she just doesn't have the energy to finish the job and just ends up being turned to stone because I guess that's just what happens. And in most other versions of Devilman, this is treated as both a physical and sexual awakening here. I'm sure there is some very interesting galaxy brain takes here, and that the only two people to truly best Akira in combat are Siren, who was in love with Amon, and Ryo, who was in love with Akira. We don't really see demons having too complicated of character arcs because most of them are just guys ready to kill, but I guess it is interesting that for demons, this establishes that having feelings isn't something that's just exclusive to Akira and Ryo. They both have very different circumstances for becoming demons, but it's something that normalizes that the foot soldiers can just have feelings too, especially for guys like Game, because he doesn't just let Siren decapitate him and use his body just because he hates Devilman, although I'm sure that does help. I'm sure there is a fun, nice guy cuck joke to be made here, but instead, let's take that love one step further and say that even demons are capable of not only love, but being selfless. While Gaim claims that they are both going to live by fusing, for practical purposes, he's just dead. And Gaim dies in the hopes that Siren will be able to defeat Devilman, and without Ryo stepping in. And I suppose it's also possible that Siren was actually able to kill Devilman the whole time, but just couldn't muster up the strength not because she was too tired, but because of her love for Amon. But generally speaking, I like to believe it's a little of A and a little of B. And perhaps on some level, Siren just wasn't able to muster up the strength to kill Amon, but also she just ran out of steam. So I've actually harped on Akira quite a bit, but it's actually very interesting to know that while the narrative generally finds Akira to be noble and unique among people before this, Akira's own logic says that's impossible, and that other Devilman have to exist because he's not perfect and he can't be a paragon of pure good regardless of what Ryo thinks and what the narrative implies. Akira, again, did let a lot of people die, and this did mostly happen out of peer pressure, and people are susceptible to peer pressure. And when you think about it, how many of us aren't susceptible to sometimes doing a little bit of ritualistic summoning with a couple of sketchy associates? Anyway, like I mentioned before, Akira is always in conflict with the demon spirit of Amon, much like a werewolf that is afraid of their more primal side. Whereas a werewolf, that would be the violent side, or maybe a vampire, where the thing to fear here is just their sexuality going wild. In some ways, Devilman is an indirect rebuke of that, in saying that if you have a strong enough spirit and just are of a strong enough nature, then you too will be able to resist the urge to retweet some horny pics on your professional account, or mangle someone's face for wearing their backpack on a crowded train. Now, maybe these urges aren't something that people can overcome all the time, or even most of the time, but the fact that the seeds of this exist is something that's worth fighting for. And the temptation to do generally bad stuff is maybe a little uncouth in modern day society, but on the other hand, not always necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you may just be fine shooting your shot, provided you don't get upset that you get rejected. Or sometimes it may be okay to ask someone to take off their backpack in a crowded train, but not necessarily throw them in front of the train for daring to do so in the first place, regardless of how tempting it may be. And all of that reptile brain passion that you have can definitely be used to do something good, like being a firefighter or something else beneficial to society. While after Akira becomes Devilman, while his agenda is mostly sex and violence, there's also a lot of other things that was good with this. For example, now he's able to more openly communicate with women, or he's more able to quell his own social anxieties and actually make change for good, instead of just letting his feelings be let loose like a wild animal. And he's now able to take all that passion and energy and replace his social anxiety, and ultimately let his strong moral compass take the wheel, with his more primal nature being in service of that. Like, if his heart wants to do something but also has a lot of anxiety in it, the reptile brain in him will just shove that part away and let him do what he wants to do, while also being able to put a quell on if he's gone too far. Like, having a lust for violence is definitely the opposite of a bad thing if there's a huge demon invasion going on. And sometimes demons simply aren't able to be carefully negotiated with, and the only language that they're going to understand is to have their intestines ripped out. So I think I've mostly spoken my piece about Akira, so let's move on to Ryo. Ryo is Akira's morally dubious best friend and primary villain who, as we discussed several times before, is also Satan. His father went mad due to demons, and as turns out, Ryo the regular human would also die here as well. And at that time, Psycho Jenny, who would be a mother-like figure to Satan, would erase his mind and have Satan live as Ryo as a sleeper agent for the demons. And subtly over time, more and more of Satan's influence would manipulate Ryo's actions to where he would eventually want Akira to become the Devilman, to have a champion of good, and have an effective tool to fight the demons. But in reality, Ryo is hanging out with Akira, would actually just make Satan fall in love with Akira, and turning Akira into the Devilman was again a ploy to spare Akira from the incoming apocalypse. Earlier I said that Satan was actually very gay, but in reality Satan is androgynous, probably genderless or bigender, but I feel like that type of vocabulary of just saying non-binary wouldn't really exist in Cold War era Japan, or America for that matter. In this way, Ryo and Satan come off as a classic queer-coded villain, except for that this time it's not just coding, but that there's actually queer context going on. Go Nagai would specifically design Satan with the best quality of men and women here. My apologies for just inserting things that Devilman have influence just wherever I want to, because a full-on video about the influence of Devilman would make this video 3 times as long. But that does seem to be the inspiration from Yubel from Yu-Gi-Oh! And one interesting thing about having queer-coded villains is that this is another example of the anime theme of characters that are so cool and holy and metaphysical that they have the ability to go, gender, I hardly know her. This is also one of the earlier examples of a popular manga I can think of that is more or less comfortable having a deliberately openly gay character, or at the very least a not straight character, in the context of an ultra-violent series. This particular flavor of queer-coded ultra-violence would also go on to push later series like JoJo, Berserk, and Claymore, and having its logical extreme in Devilman Crybaby. This is probably because ultraviolent media tends to be relatively countercultural, and generally speaking, countercultural media also tends to be safe spaces for stories about queer people. So all throughout this story, as the stakes are getting higher and the battles are becoming more difficult, Ryo is very adamant on Akira backing down on fighting the demon invasions, and initially the air of this is it would be stupid for you to try to fight the demons, especially when people are so bad. You should try to be apathetic towards this, and regardless of Satan's influence, this would end up just becoming genuine concern about Akira's life, because the cards just look bad if he tried to take Satan in a fight. For the most part, this is all subconscious for Ryo, and entirely ignored when it comes to Akira, as he doesn't really have any particular pro or against this, because Akira is mostly interested in doing good here. It's also worth noting the interesting contrast between Ryo and Akira's transformation. For Akira, Amon is just silently influencing his will, and it's mostly limited to being tucked away inside of Akira's reptile brain, and just being the thing that also just triggers puberty, I suppose. Well, that and all of his cool demonic powers. But outside of that, mostly Amon likes to stay in the background. To Akira, Siren, who was Amon's ex-lover, is just some asshole, and Amon doesn't really exploit any particular will over Akira, outside of the general brutal sexual nature of demons. But for Ryo and Satan, they are just one person, and before Ryo awakens, the two practically have 2 separate wills of their own. And unlike Amon, who doesn't really have that much influence over Ryo's personality and moral compass, Satan does seem to. Ryo's comfortable opening fire on people, he's comfortable having a large black mass that would result in mass human sacrifice, and when things start really getting bad, even before he knows he's Satan, he's more or less comfortable with letting these things happen. And that almost certainly is due to Satan's influence. And even the fact that he believes that demons killed his father, he doesn't really have too much of a grudge here, and is mostly concerned with the wider spread and coming demon invasion. He also really enjoys drugs. I wasn't around in the 70s, or am I Japanese, but to my understanding, Japan historically has been way less tolerant to drugs, and general law breaking. And Akira is just down with the devil's lettuce and having a fake ID, which are both, in 2020 times, I suppose, more innocuous, or at the very least in the States. And also things that happen at anime cons. But even if they are innocuous in today's times, relative to the 70s in Japan, these all paint Ryo as a very sketchy character who says he doesn't care about the law, fuck the police, and not in the ACAB way. I like this meta characterization of Ryo. He thinks he's above humanity even before becoming Satan. I know that I'm mentioning a lot of other series that Devilman would influence, but forgive me for another one. This could also just be the inspiration of Dio. Or maybe there is also another comparison from Griffith from Berserk, in that despite their humble upbringings, they all have very world-shattering ambitions, and also are very, very gay and have an interesting relationship with the protagonist. Specifically, their meat-headed protagonist would be someone that, on some level, they probably fell in love with, and specifically in some ways wanted them to survive the incoming apocalypse, and also just seemed to be subject to forces far beyond their will. For Dio, this is a little bit nebulous, but fate does serve in some ways as that kind of force for JoJo, especially its villains. For Griffith, that would be the God Hand, and for Ryo, that would be Satan. And with the exception of Griffith, because that series just hasn't ended yet, all of these characters would end up being hoisted by their petards by wanting their respective protagonists to live. For Griffith, he's given Guts a reason to come after him. So he, in some ways, if he does win ultimately, has created his own demise. Dio would want to take Jonathan's body, and that would eventually just make the Joestar curse, where every Joestar has the ability to come after him and defeat his stand. And for Ryo, he would ultimately make Devilman a thing. Later adaptations of Devilman would double down on this being a tragic or ironic twist, with Ryo facing retribution for his actions or being turned on his head or hoisted by his own petards. And there's also Violence Jack, that is somewhat of a follow-up to Devilman, where Ryo is incarnated as a guy who's been dismembered and treated like a dog, which does, have a lot of ableist imagery, but, well, that's the 70s for you. Presumably this is done as a form of divine punishment. Again, excuse the ableism, but that's just what the text seems to be. Okay, so now we're on to the best character, Miki Makimura. So Miki is one of my favorite type of characters that don't really have powers or tools, but have everything going for them to defend themselves. For example, wanting to be alive. Usually shonen anime girlfriends and kid characters are the types that have this weird aversion to staying alive. I mean, they do want to live, but they certainly don't act like it. Just barging into danger and screaming for help. Not that you shouldn't scream for help or anything like that, but Kagome just kind of screams, while Miki, on the other hand, is scratching and biting and going for the eyes the entire way. And that's, in many ways, doing your own due diligence that I can respect. Miki Makimura does not give a fuck. She does a damsel in distress thing a few times, but more akin to her 90s counterparts, not just in terms of Devilman adaptations, but just her peers as women in the 90s, like Keiko Yukimura. Miki generally does fight back. At the beginning of the series, Akira is far too meek to fight against these thugs, but Miki knew that Akira wasn't going to step in and just kind of assumed that he wouldn't, so she's doing her due diligence to say these guys can fuck off. She's brash, she's short-tempered, and she isn't like that for no reason exactly. She isn't just an anime tsundere that's just kind of a jerk because she's mean and just kind of like that. But she's mean to people that were generally mean to her first, and having a temper can just be a byproduct of always being put in these type of stressful situations. However, with that, even as much as she likes Akira, she wants a bad boy, and she knows it. At no point does the narrative ever pose this as a bad thing. She always loves Akira and appreciates that he's a sweet guy, but she wants him to really just go for it, and it's just not in him to do that. She wants him to take a stand, she wants him to fight back, and it just irritates the hell out of her that this just doesn't seem to be an Akira's character. And she also isn't exactly thrilled that Akira always sees her as being more aggressive and always really mad. So when he becomes the Devilman and just able to really throw down and really stand up for what he wants and what he believes in, that's when things really get rolling as a couple for them. And that's your life lessons, fellas. Girls like chads, not incels. Especially chads that like to keep personal space in mind, which Akira is always trying to do as the Devilman. Anyway, her and the goons from the first chapter end up having all sorts of adventures, up to and including fighting off an army of spiders. And Miki isn't exactly a big fighter, as you would imagine. She doesn't feel entitled either, interestingly, to have Akira come to her rescue. And she does not believe that being lacking in powers is an excuse not to fight back. Towards the finale, demon hunters are onto her having some type of connection with demons, and the people think that she's a witch. This witch motif would actually follow Miki through several adaptations of Devilman, and probably become the chief inspiration for Devilman Grimoire, which does reimagine Devilman, but if Miki was also a bigger part of the plot and a demon in her own right. Which is a pretty natural place for that kind of story to go, because Miki is a character with so much agency in a time where a lot of women characters, especially in shonen works, just didn't have any whatsoever. But anyway, unfortunately, Miki has found herself cornered by demon hunters. And they're more of an angry mob than actual proper demon hunters, because if they had actually found a demon, they probably would all be disemboweled by now. And instead of just screaming for help, as a lot of other characters would do, and a lot of other horror characters would do, Miki is way more interested in saying, you know, if you guys want to live, start making Molotov cocktails, start grabbing knives, and start going for the throat. While this would be another example of woman in the refrigerator, a common trope where a female lead is killed off mostly for the benefit of the hero, or rather benefit because it gives the hero more drama and more conflict and more reason to go out and fight. The story of Miki Makimura seems a little more interesting because I actually am invested in her struggle independently of Akira. And she does seem to be more or less acting independently of Akira. Because while Akira does save her a lot, she understands that he can't always be there. And this is the case where he wasn't there and she ultimately meets her demise. But since this is at least somewhat an example of woman in refrigerator, for Akira, the death of Miki Makimura represents the death of human kindness, because look at what's going on. They're making concentration camps, they're making death squads, and they've literally taken everything away from this man. So that kind of proves to him that even if he is trying to be a good-natured, good-spirited person, he ultimately may be wrong on this, and perhaps humanity isn't worth fighting for after all. Once again, I'm sure there is another interesting Galaxy Brain take about the idea of taking some amount of glee in gruesome violence happening to women here. And across cultural borders, that does seem to be a pretty common trope to have some amount of glee in women being harmed. But my brain is extremely small and I just like violence in general, so if someone else out there wants to make their own commentary on that, I advise it and I would like to see it because it sounds very interesting. And the huge overlap of feminist theory and horror is a academic field that I only have at best a passing understanding of. So I think it'd be way more interesting to let someone else who has a stronger understanding of that subsection of feminist theory step up to the plate here. Especially because it's a subsection here, because it's not just horror, but also manga, and also manga from the 70s. Okay, I think I've spoken my piece about the true champion here, Miki Makimura. So now it's time to talk about what's at the heart and soul of Devilman. So Devilman was written at the height of the Cold War, and it's a story that's mostly about seeing humanity and your fellow person as people, despite your differences you may have, and trying your best to not see other people as an inherent threat, and the general failure of that leading to the abject end of civilization itself. Devilman paints the picture that the road to societal collapse is paved with not seeing the value in other human lives, because if you don't see value in it, then who else will? If you're comfortable with killing a human in cold blood, then you would probably also be comfortable killing several humans, and you would probably also be comfortable putting those humans in some type of horrible camp that they shouldn't be in, that commonly they are left to die in because you have deemed them not human. And you're probably comfortable having roaming death squads and inhumane angry mobs just killing people that you deem to be other. The ultimate result of this is killing the idea of good faith in human spirit itself. And when you don't even have that to believe in, well, you become more comfortable doing more progressively extreme things to secure yourself from others. This seems like a little bit of a stretch, but again, in Devilman lore, there is no more Russia, because Russia has faced nuclear mostly in service to keep everyone quote-unquote safe. And Miki Makimura faced a senseless death to keep everyone else safe. And the ultimate result of that is Devilman, the only hope for humanity, has been stripped of any goodwill that he would have otherwise wanted to apply to humanity. And this is shown more in other adaptations, specifically Devilman Crybaby. But as the plot goes on and humanity's efforts to keep itself safe become more and more extreme, Akira ends up confiding more and more with his fellow demons. And even if this is just a sort of one-page thing in terms of the manga, he did basically turn to his fellow demons who understand him quite a bit better as a pillar of support for the next 20 years as he would rise an army in order to face the forces of Satan. Oh, hello everyone. It's me, Sydney, from the distant year of 2020, where we seem to be living in the bad Devilman future. Usually I don't mind getting political, and sometimes that is something that I pick series for Manga Dungeon specifically for, like the incidental themes of feminism and environmentalism that are inherent in Pokemon. But at this very moment, as we are seeing very widespread civil discontent that is directly tied to not seeing humanity in your fellow human being, very specifically at this moment, Black and Hispanic people. For Hispanic people, being denied citizenship and shipped out to concentration camps, and for Black people being denied pretty much every right outside of that of citizenship. I feel like it might be a little bit dishonest if I didn't disclose that this script was written in 2018, and I just sat on it for a long time because it just got too long, and I just wasn't totally satisfied with it. So if that last couple of paragraphs felt a little bit too on the nose, just know that no event in human society is entirely without precedent, and sometimes things play out in surprisingly eerie ways. And the phrase art is political isn't that art necessarily has an agenda, even though Devilman specifically does, but art doesn't exist in a void, and does draw from influences in real life. And in this case, it is drawing from how empires tend to fall. Okay, back to ignorant 2019 me that has already written the script. Seeing humanity in others doesn't necessarily just apply to humans themselves. It can also apply to demons, although not in the same nuanced way. Each demon has their own motivation for doing what they do. Satan thinks God is a big bigot and an asshole. Siren fights because she loves Amon and finds Akira's fusion with Amon to be a disgrace and him trampling on Amon's demonic pride. Game, the demon that fused with Siren, simply calculated that he loved her so much to where he can make the calculation of if neither one of them was going to live, he would rather ensure that Siren was the one that lived instead of doing what other villains do, which would be run away or failing to team up to fight Akira for one last-ditch effort, as most cartoon goons would do. I mean, most of the demons are just straight-up evil, but a lot of them do have a certain rhyme or reason for why they're doing what they do. I'm sure many of them are thinking it would be funny and hilarious to just attack an orphanage. Speaking of goons, the thugs from the beginning of the series and towards the end show a lot of humanity. They show up multiple times over the series and show that they are capable of being real humans that can come together in the worst of times. They put aside the fact that they once used to be assholes and faceless goons, and that they would mostly be more so at home as minor Power Ranger villains. And I think that says something more about them than Go Nagai's feelings on the flexible nature of the human spirit. I'm willing to argue that the reason Devilman would ultimately lose to Satan is because he did what the narrative finds to be the biggest sin one can do. Stop believing in humanity and no longer believing in the human spirit. Compare this with the ending of Crybaby, where Akira is pissed and is fighting for revenge, but he never truly gave up on humanity. Yes, God still, in both versions, wipes the slate clean, and Satan does end up waxing nostalgically only to realize Akira is gone, but in that context, this is unambiguously posed as a victory for Akira, and a beacon that mankind didn't go down without a fight. Speaking of things that are on the notes, another big theme here is that puberty is bad. You have a lot of cool new powers and hair and all sorts of stuff, but you would probably want to give puberty a 1-star on Yelp or whatever, as it is gross. And you are now stuck with constantly needing to reconcile the way you feel with the reality around you that you actually don't have a huge amount of influence over what you do, or at least for most teens anyway. You still have to go to school, you still have to manage social norms, and everything your body is telling you indicates you should do the opposite of that. This seems to be what the demonic transformations are more or less coded as, and again, make that devil and crybaby. Let's go back to Rio for a moment. For queer people, puberty is even more of a strenuous process, because on top of the aforementioned things, you have to deal with your transformation into being a complete person, in many ways seen as monstrous for basically arbitrary reasons. I'm not sure if the broader demonic transformation process is necessarily a queer-coded thing in the original Devilman, but it absolutely is in Crybaby, where with the lone exception of Akira, most of the other Devilmen are explicitly queer, and their struggles as being demon humans generally does overlap with the struggles of queer people. But back onto the original, Rio's process of becoming Satan is one that he didn't know would happen. It more or less goes against what he understands a demonic transformation to be. It doesn't really seem to have a whole lot of pathways or people that have a nuanced understanding that aren't already on the other side of a process that he already doesn't understand. And for both queer people and for Rio's experience, or at least in the way the narrative frames it, the narrative frames this particular type of transformation as somehow extra. Stuff that didn't need to happen, but the fact of the matter is that these things do happen. Sometimes it turns out you're Satan, and sometimes it turns out that you're gay, and that's not exactly extra or not necessary. In fact, it's something that's inevitable, regardless of how both the narrative and people in real life seem to feel about it. This part may be somewhat of a stretch, but I do think it's interesting that a queer-coded villain would end up ultimately being the enemy of God. Also, I didn't mention earlier, but Rio is also white. His father is half Japanese and his mother is American, and generally speaking, in the 70s at least, most people understood Americans to be white people. So it's also interesting that the person that is the enemy of God and trying to wipe out humanity would be primarily opposed by a person of color. Not that people in Japan necessarily see themselves as people of color. Okay, we're close to the end, so now it's time for things that are interesting that I didn't have natural space in the video for. So before the Seven Seas Classic Collection, they actually gave Devilman a few shots to be localized. The first was by Verotic, and I'm guessing they started with Shin Devilman because it is a much shorter, much easier to digest work than Devilman. Go Nagai himself would actually try to later self-publish Devilman in English. If I wasn't so poor, I'd put out a bounty for that, but I am poor, so what can you do? And lastly, allegedly the plan was for God to be a general demon, and after he has wiped out the demons, he would send down an angel, and Satan would feel bad about everything that's gone on and turn himself in. This was shortened because Devilman was cancelled, presumably pretty close to its already scheduled finale. But I do think this was an overall improvement, and it also would become a seminal moment for anime and manga at large, as this type of conclusion would be most notably mimicked by the end of Evangelion, where instead of getting the fully realized resolution, instead we are just left with the carnage that has just went down and just given a brief moment to reflect on what's happened. And I think for Devilman, this actually greatly increases the drama. Rio doesn't get to turn himself in. He just gets to spend the last few moments with the complexity of his existence and hating God and killing Akira, and everything being for nothing. Or, equally as valid, maybe all of this was worth it, because even if God ultimately was going to wipe out humanity and the entire Earth anyway, ultimately, Rio, or Satan, got the opportunity to meet and fall in love with Akira. But this is why I love those kind of endings, because they force you to reflect more so on the themes of the series instead of focusing on the end result of the series. Okay, that's the end of the video. Finally, it only took an hour, which I guess is still shorter than the last one. These videos take a very long time to make, and the algorithm hates that I seemingly just don't make a video for 6 months or however long it's been. So go ahead and like it, and then subscribe if you feel like seeing more. Don't forget to tell your friends if this video seemed sick as fuck and you want to see other people have big-brained ideas about manga. And if you feel like being radicalized or whatever have you, come on down and hit me up on Twitter. Okay, what would an anime guy say at the end? See you, Space Cowboy? No, wait, fuck, that doesn't work. This is manga. Tomare, you're watching the video the wrong way. Start at the other end of the video.
Devilman